Hey everybody, today we are going to start the small book of Amos, and we're going to spend the next 3 weeks, the rest of this month, kind of going through this short book. There's 9 chapters. It's a really quick read. It's one of the books that we probably don't often turn to in the Old Testament, but it's a really great book. We're told at the beginning that Amos, however you want to say it, he is a shepherd by trade, and the Lord calls him out of his job as a shepherd to speak to the people of Israel. The interesting thing is he's from a town called Tekoa, which is about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. So he's from the southern kingdom of Judah, and God calls him to the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, we'll talk more about this next week, about why this is important, but he's going to essentially now a different people group. And he goes to 2 different places, which are very significant. He goes to a place called Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And then he also preaches at a place called Bethel, which is in the southern part of the northern kingdom, still in Israel. And Samaria is important because it was the capital, the political capital, administrative capital of Israel. And Bethel was the capital of the religious system. And we'll talk more about why these places are important and how what gets associated with them next week as we jump into the next couple chapters. But for our purposes today, Amos is a guy from Judah, the southern kingdom. He moves to Israel, the northern kingdom, and he preaches a sermon, or a series of sermons in a couple of significant places there. He's operating in 765 to 760 BC. Why this is significant is that most likely Amos is probably one of the very first prophets that we have their recorded messages. So obviously there's other prophets that we read about in First and Second Kings that come, but as far as kind of their own book, Amos is probably the first. And so all the other ones that we've already looked at before, so like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, those actually probably come later. Those guys existed kind of later in history. So Amos is probably the very first prophet who people collected his sermons, his sayings, his writings. Because he existed when both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were still quite in kind of healthy places. Certainly before Assyria had invaded in 722, 721 BC, the northern kingdom, and before Babylon invaded the southern kingdom in 587, 586 BC. And so this is kind of, at least 40 years before the northern kingdom of Israel gets destroyed and exiled by the Assyrians. So this is significant. And what do we find in the first 3 chapters of Amos? Well, this one is what I would like to call a sizzling start. This is what our kids learn in school, how to write a story. You write it with a sizzling start and an interesting opening. We might think of it as a movie that has lots of drama. I think of Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he goes into that, the temple, and he has to remove the thing, and then the giant ball comes out. Anyway, it's amazing start to the book, right? But you might not be able to tell just based on the words alone, because there's a lot of people and places that get mentioned that aren't very familiar to us today. But let me just give you the summary of what the opening chapters are. So essentially, Amos turns around and he pronounces judgment on all of Israel's neighbors. So he looks at the Ammonites, he looks at the Edomites, he looks at the people who are living in Tyre and Sidon. So basically, these are all kind of nations that are surrounding the nations of Israel and Judah. And for most of their history, they've had a rocky relationship with these countries. They haven't gotten along, even though they have a lot in common. And we see these nations kind of mentioned throughout the Bible, but they just don't get along. They're often at war, at odds with each other, and it's not kind of a healthy relationship. And so Amos starts off his preaching by pronouncing judgment on all these surrounding neighbors, right? It's kind of like today you might think of God saying, hey, New Zealand, you've really messed it up, and I'm going to come and destroy your nation. And Papua New Guinea, well, you have really committed some serious sin, and so I'm going to, wipe your sin off the face of the earth, or whatever it may be. And so he's going all around all these kind of nations that we have these, the people would have these rivalries with, right? And so as people are hearing this sermon or reading this text, what they're probably doing is starting to cheer, like, yeah, stick it to him, God. Stick it to, the people in the Ammonites. Stick it to the people in Edom. Stick it to all these, the people in Egypt. Yeah, go get them, God. And they're getting fired up, right? Because judgment after judgment after judgment comes on every single one of these surrounding nations. And they're like, yeah, God is going to get you. This is awesome. But then, at the end of chapter 2, the tide shifts, right? So as people are being drawn into this story and getting really riled up that God is going to get all of their neighbors for all their detestable behavior, then the tides turn. He says, then, Judah, I'm going to come after you. Wait, what? How do we get mentioned with all the... Israel, for all of your sin, you are going to face judgment. And so as it has this narrative effect that it draws you in, right? That draws you, the audience member, the listener, the reader in, like, yeah, God's going to go get them. This is awesome. And then the camera turns, right? But you, Israel, you, Judah, you haven't been living the ways of God. You have mistreated one another. You've turned to other gods. You're engaging in temple prostitution. You're sacrificing your children to foreign gods. You're doing all of these detestable things, and just like judgment is coming to all of these neighbors for their sin, you're not safe either. It's coming to you. So this message hits really hard, and it hits really close to home. It has this amazing narrative, dramatic effect that is drawing people in. Yeah, God, go get him. And like all of a sudden, now God's going to go after us for our sin. And we'll talk about more about exactly, what the issues are underlying, especially the people of Israel. But we often have the same kind of thing, right? We look around us and we're like, God, get rid of those evildoers around us, right? God, if you could just bring judgment and justice to that person and these people and that work group and that country who are doing it, doing the wrong thing, God, I'm all for it. But then the camera turns to us. What about you, Travis? What about you, Narrabeen Baptist Church? What about the sins that you're doing? What about your greed? What about your wickedness? What about the gods that you run after? What about, the sexual sins that you think nobody sees? What about all of these things that you think you've gotten away with, but God knows what you're doing? And the camera turns, and it's meant to have this really dramatic effect on the listener. And it's meant to have the same effect on us today. So even though we don't know who these people are necessarily, these nations and these countries and what they've done, it has the same effect. God, pronounce judgment on the wider world around us, but what about when it turns to us? And it's meant to, draw us in, but also help us to realize that we too are broken. We too have messed up. We too are in need of forgiveness. And so that's what Amos's book is aiming to do, and we'll explore more next week in this amazing book. So I'll leave it that with you for now, and we'll see you next week. Bye.